Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again with part 3 of the high jump series. We'll just start from here. Let me do one little step here. Wait a minute. I need to get my pen working. Okay, so as I said at the end of talk number 2, the airborne rotations of a high jump are essentially a twisting somersault. So it's a somersault rotation and a twist rotation that happen at the same time. So we're looking here first at the twist rotation. Twist rotation is rotation about a vertical axis. It's a rotation that makes the back of the athlete point towards the bar, and it happens very soon after takeoff. And then the somersault rotation, it's a rotation about an axis that is more or less parallel to the bar. So each one of these two rotations, which happen at the same time, each one of these two rotations requires angular momentum. So we need a twisting component of angular momentum to produce the twist rotation, and we also need a somersaulting component of angular momentum to produce the somersault. In the previous lecture, we talked about the twisting component. I explained how you generate it, and I also explained that the twist rotation is one that normally people do not have a problem with. Sometimes people have problems, but it's very, very rare, very unusual. So today we will talk about the somersaulting component. And this is a rotation in which many people have problems. Okay, so we'll look at the somersaulting component of angular momentum. So as I said before, it's a rotation about an axis that is more or less parallel to the bar. Okay, so the somersaulting rotation is a rotation about an axis that is more or less parallel to the bar. And if you look at these little arrows here, these red arrows, they show you the direction of that rotation. And this rotation will produce this position on top of the bar. And of course, because you're doing the somersault, but also you're doing the twist at the same time, you end up in this position, which looks like more or less that. So as I said before, this is the somersaulting rotation is one about which quite a few people have problems. And because of that, we want to understand it in detail, how the somersaulting angular momentum is produced and what can produce the problems. Okay, so we saw that the total angular momentum is composed of a twist component and the somersaulting component. In turn, the somersaulting component is going to have two components of its own. So we're going to break down this somersaulting angular momentum into two components, and they're going to be two components relative to the final direction of the run-up. So the high jump, so what is the final direction of the run-up? Well, the high jumper starts the run-up traveling perpendicular to the bar. Then the athlete starts the curve and goes for a left foot takeoff. The athlete turns to the left more and more and more. And by the time that the foot gets planted on the ground, the athlete is not going perpendicular to the bar anymore, but also he or she is not going parallel to the bar either. The athlete will be at an angle with respect to the bar, maybe 35 or 40 degrees. And that is what is indicated by the big arrow on the ground. So, So the athlete is going to do two somersault rotations. One is going to be the forward somersault rotation, The other one is going to be a lateral somersault rotation. So this line that you see here, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay, so this line here is the axis of rotation for the forward somersaulting angular momentum, forward somersaulting rotation. So imagine now that instead of a high jumper, if we had here a gymnast, it would be a gymnast traveling in a straight line at a 35 or 40 degree angle relative to the bar. And then this gymnast is going to do a perfect forward somersault. So this gymnast would rotate in the way indicated by the arrows here. And at the peak of the jump, the athlete would be like that. The gymnast would be like that. Of course, our high jumper does not want to be like that. Our high jumper wants the body to be horizontal but perpendicular to the bar. So our high jumper is going to have not only this forward somersaulting rotation, our high jumper is also going to have at the same time a lateral somersaulting rotation. So this will be a rotation that will be towards the right. It's seen from behind, it will look like a clockwise rotation. And this rotation, it would look like this. So these are the arrows. First, this rotation would be difficult to do, right? It's a rotation that if you're, imagine our gymnast now, again, coming at an angle to the bar, then the gymnast would take off and would be rotating clockwise, seen from behind. It's like, in English, you call it a cartwheel rotation to the right. It would be difficult to do, but let's imagine that the gymnast could do it. So at the peak of the jump, this athlete, if he only had lateral somersaulting angular momentum, the athlete would end up in this position over the bar. Of course, our high jumper does not want to be like this. A high jumper, so this is a position where the head would be around here and the legs should be there. So the head would be closer to the right standard and the feet would be closer to the left standard. You don't want that. So what our high jumper will do is he or she will produce forward somersaulting angular momentum and lateral somersaulting angular momentum at the same time. So when you combine the two, the athlete will look like you see here. So it will be the position that the athlete wants. So you need forward somersaulting angular momentum and lateral somersaulting angular momentum to produce total somersaulting angular momentum. I have a question. I have in my screen, I have a red line here. Do you see that?
Yes, it is there.
Ah, okay. Well, let me get out and come back in again because I want to get rid of that line. Forget that? Okay. Morta. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So first we're going to be looking at the forward component of somersaulting angular momentum. The best place to watch this rotation is from a direction perpendicular to the final direction of the run-up. Okay, so this is your eye, and this is the direction of viewing. And the view that you would see would be this one. Okay, so let's take a look at this jump now only from the end of the takeoff onward. So normally I want to ask people and say, okay, do you see here a clockwise rotation or a counterclockwise rotation? And usually there are some problems because people think, oh yes, if I see it from above, I can see a counterclockwise rotation. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about on the plane of your computer screen, do you see clockwise or counterclockwise? So for that, I'm trying a new trick here. Okay, so this is a graphic that is really, it's the high jumper. But what I've done here is I've replaced, the body has a number of segments. You have the head, your trunk, your legs, and so on. And here I replaced every segment by a little circle. Okay, so here what you have, this is the center of mass. This is going to stay in place all the time. Okay, then this will be the head, upper trunk, middle trunk, lower trunk, right upper arm, right forearm, right hand, and the same thing for the left side, upper arm, forearm, hand for the left arm. And here you have the right thigh, right shank, right foot. And here for the left one, left thigh, left shank, left foot. So this is our high jumper, the same as what we just saw a minute ago, and it's exactly the same view. It's a view perpendicular to the final direction of the run-up. So what I'm going to do now is, after telling you what all these segments are, I want you to forget that this is a high jumper. Think of this as just a whole bunch of little black circles, and you have to think what you will see in the animation. You want to see if you see mainly clockwise rotation or counterclockwise rotation. Now, some of them will move clockwise, some of them will move counterclockwise, and in some parts of the jump, you will find it difficult to know if overall, if it's a net clockwise or counterclockwise movement. But in some parts of the jump, it'll be very clear if it's in one direction or the other one. Okay, here goes the animation.
Grisorio, per piacere, spenga il microfono.
Okay, so think clockwise or counterclockwise, especially near the end, like around here. I think it's very clear in that final part. It's very clear which way it is.
Verso la fine è abbastanza chiaro in che direzione sta andando.
Around here, this part.
Questa parte.
Okay, so think, did you see mainly clockwise or did you see mainly counterclockwise? Well, the solution is you should have seen counterclockwise. Okay, so, and if this is just a visual way of looking at it, but we can measure this, and it is counterclockwise. Okay, so how does this produce? So our high jumper is going to have forward somersaulting angular momentum, which in this view is a counterclockwise angular momentum. It's counterclockwise rotation. So here's a high jumper in the middle of the takeoff phase. And how is this jumper going to produce this counterclockwise angular momentum, this counterclockwise forward somersaulting angular momentum? Well, he will produce it by pushing on the ground forward and downward. So this is the force that the foot makes on the ground. And by reaction, the athlete receives this force. So you can see that this yellow force passes a little bit below the center of mass, which is this point here. And because of that, it produces what is called a torque, or a moment of force about the center of mass. So I have to get out of the PowerPoint for a second here to show you something. Okay, so here's our high jumper. And if I make a force on it like this, which is what we had in the animation, a force like this will make him rotate this way. So now I have to get back. How do I get back? The red line is gone.
Fantastic.
Okay, so this is the reaction force. So you can see how this reaction force passing underneath the center of mass is producing a counterclockwise rotation of the athlete. It's producing counterclockwise angular momentum. Okay, so the athlete does not think about any of this. He or she just does it. But this is really what is happening. So this creates a potential problem here, because think about it. Before you put your takeoff foot on the ground, your angular momentum is approximately 0. During the takeoff phase, that changes, so it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Then you plant the foot on the ground, and it becomes 0, 20, 40, 80, 100. Then you leave the ground, and then it's constant, and it's 100, 100, 100, 100. So during the run-up, your angular momentum is about 0. It's not exactly 0, but it's about 0. After you leave the ground, it's, let's say, 100. But during the takeoff phase, it's not 0. It's somewhere between 0 and 100. It's changing from 0 to 100. So the average angular momentum during the takeoff phase is somewhere between 0 and 100. Maybe it's 50, maybe it's 40, maybe it's 60, but it's going to have some value of forward somersaulting angular momentum already during the takeoff phase. So there's going to be an increase from 0 to 100, but the main point is that there's going to be some angular momentum already during the takeoff phase. What we have then is that if the athlete reached the beginning of the takeoff phase with the body vertical, then by the end of the takeoff phase, since he will be rotating forward during the takeoff phase, by the end of the takeoff phase, the athlete will have a big lean forward. And this is not good because at the end of the takeoff phase, you would like to be vertical or very close to vertical, because by being vertical, your center of mass is at the highest position. So that gives you a bigger vertical range of motion of travel for the center of mass from the plant until you leave the ground. You want to maximize that height. So if you're vertical at the end of the takeoff, that allows you to reach a bigger height at the peak of the jump. Okay, so we want to be vertical at the end of the takeoff, but we will be rotating counterclockwise during the takeoff phase. So how do you have to be at the beginning of the takeoff phase then? Well, you have to have a backward lean at the start of the takeoff phase. So here, you see the red line, that's the backward lean of the body at the start of the takeoff phase. Now, I have to make a clarification here. This line, I have aligned it with the trunk, with the longitudinal axis of the trunk. There is no such thing as an orientation of the whole body, but the trunk has about half of the mass of the whole body, so it's the best choice we have to define like an orientation for the whole body. It's imperfect, but it's the best thing we have. Yeah, there's no such thing as orientation of the whole body. That's just, it doesn't exist. So the athlete will go from this backward lean at the start of the takeoff phase to this position we see over here, which is a vertical position at the end of the takeoff phase. So we have a need for a backward lean at the start of the takeoff phase, obviously. So normally during the run-up, the high jump run-up, I like to compare it with a 400-meter run or an 800-meter run. It's a very similar way of running. And in this running, you will be, with the trunk will be more or less vertical with a little bit of forward lean maybe. But then in the last step of the run-up, it's necessary to throw the hips forward more so that you get this backward lean of the trunk. So the athlete should not think of moving the shoulders backward. You should think of moving the hip forward. Okay, so what happens if our athlete does not get into this good backward leaning position at the start of the takeoff phase? Well, then the athlete has problems, and there's no good solution. One possibility is the athlete could say, okay, so I am vertical at the start of the takeoff phase, and I want to rotate really nicely in the air. So I'm going to generate forward somersaulting angular momentum, and I will finish the takeoff leaning forward, like maybe 20 degrees forward. So in that situation, if the athlete does that, the athlete will rotate very nicely in the air, but the height of the jump will be compromised. The height of the jump will be much lower than it should have been. Another option would be to say, oh no, I don't want to lean forward. I'll stay vertical. I'm vertical at the start of the takeoff phase. I'll still be vertical at the end of the takeoff phase. In that case, the height of the jump will be good. The center of mass will reach a good height, but since you're not rotating forward during the takeoff phase, you're not generating angular momentum, and you will have a small amount of somersaulting angular momentum, and your rotation over the bar will be a mess. So in this situation, the center of mass will have a good height, but because your rotation is bad, the bar height that you can clear will be very far below the peak height of the center of mass. So the result of the jump will not be good. A third option, also bad, is to rotate forward, but not so much as in the first situation that he tried. So in this case, the athlete will get some angular momentum, but not enough. But also he will be leaning forward too much also, not as much as in option number 2, but he'll still be leaning forward. And then you will not get the good height you should have, but also the rotation will not be very good either. So it's another bad situation. Okay, so the moral of the story is you need to have that backward lean at the start of the takeoff phase. Okay, so let's go now and look at the lateral component of somersaulting angular momentum. So this is a rotation about an axis that is aligned with the direction of the run-up. So this is your eye here. Let's pretend that looks like an eye. It's your eye. It's the view that you would have if you were running behind the athlete as he does the run-up. So this is what it would look like. Okay, now we'll see that only after the end of the takeoff. Okay, and here again, I would like to ask you, do you see mainly clockwise or counterclockwise? And we're going to have the same problem as in the other view. So again, we're back to the little circles, but now this is in the view from behind the athlete, from the camera that is chasing the athlete. So again, I'll ask you, forget that this is a high jumper. Look at this as just a bunch of little geometric circles and see if overall you see clockwise or counterclockwise. All right, well, you should see clockwise. I think it's pretty clear. So how does the high jumper produce this? Well, here's a high jumper seen from the back, and he's moving straight into your computer screen, and he'll be pushing on the ground forward and downward, as I said before, but also he'll be pushing a little bit to the right. Okay, so, and by reaction, he's going to be getting this force, which passes a little bit to the left of the center of mass. And that produces a torque, also called a moment of force, that is clockwise about the center of mass. And I could get out of the PowerPoint and show it to you again, but I don't think it's necessary, right? I would.
Yeah, I think that they can get it.
Okay, so now the thing is that angular momentum in this direction also is 0, or approximately 0 before the takeoff phase starts. So, and at the end of the takeoff phase, this athlete will have clockwise angular momentum. Let's say that again, that is 100. It's an arbitrary number. So the angular momentum will be 0, 0, 0, 0. Foot plants on the ground, and it becomes 20, 40, 80, 100. Foot leaves the ground, and then it's 100, 100, 100, 100. So this means that during the takeoff phase itself, the angular momentum is changing from 0 to 100. So the average value during the takeoff phase is not 0, and it's not 100. It's going to be something in between, 40, 50, 60, something like that. So you already, like in the same way that we saw before, we have, in this case, clockwise angular momentum during the takeoff phase itself. So during the takeoff phase, the athlete will rotate clockwise already. So if our athlete, excuse me, if our athlete had used a straight run-up, then at this time, the athlete, not at this time, but at the start of the takeoff phase, our athlete would be perfectly vertical, seen from the back. If the athlete were perfectly vertical in this view from the back, which is what would happen if he had a straight run-up, then the athlete, by the end of the takeoff phase, would have a huge lean towards the right, maybe 20 degrees, 25 degrees toward the right. And you don't want that, because then that means that the height of the jump is going to be much lower than it should be. So instead of going from vertical at the start of the takeoff phase to a lean towards the right at the end of the takeoff phase, you would like to go from a lean towards the left at the start of the takeoff phase and vertical at the end of the takeoff phase. So we see here on the left image, we can see a lean towards the left at the start of the takeoff phase. Then during the takeoff phase, the athlete rotates towards the right, and you are in this position at the end of the takeoff phase. Now you will notice here that that final position is not vertical. It's a little bit past the vertical. What I have found in analyzing many athletes is that if you go only to the vertical, which is the ideal for getting height for the center of mass, if you go only to the vertical, there is usually very difficult or impossible to produce enough lateral somersaulting angular momentum. So what I tell the athletes is that, look, if you reach only the vertical, and if you rotate well on top of the bar, good, we're happy with that. But normally, if you reach only the vertical, your rotation, you're not going to have enough angular momentum, and your rotation is going to be bad. So bad that it would be better to go a little bit beyond the vertical, between 0 and 10 degrees beyond the vertical. It's okay in this for the generation of lateral somersaulting angular momentum. So if you lean a little bit beyond the vertical, like what you see in the slide, if you lean a little bit beyond the vertical, the peak height of the center of mass will be a little bit lower. Maybe, let's imagine, and I'm making this up, let's say it's 2 centimeters lower than if you stayed vertical at the end of the takeoff phase. But because your rotation will be so much better, you will gain maybe 4 centimeters of bar height that you can clear. Now, if you lean at the end of the takeoff, if you lean like 12, 15, 17 degrees beyond the vertical, then no, then there's a problem. Okay, so how do you get this lean to the left at the start of the takeoff phase? Well, obviously, we all know that you get that by running on a curve. So the amount of lean that you have at the end of the run-up is affected by 2 different factors. Number one is the radius of the curve. If the radius is smaller, then the curve is tighter and you have to lean more. It makes you lean more. Imagine, for example, an indoor track, a 200-meter indoor track, and you have you compare that with an outdoor track, and you have a person running a 200-meter race. So on the outdoor track, you have to lean to the left as you do the curve, but in the indoor track, you have to lean more. The other factor that affects the amount of lean is the speed of the run-up. If you run faster, you will lean more. Again, an analogy is if you look at an indoor track and you have a 10,000-meter runner, he will lean a little bit on the curves. If you have a 200-meter runner, there will be a lot more lean on the curve. Okay, so you need to have a good speed on your run-up, and you need to have a radius, and you need to combine them in such a way that you have the appropriate lean towards the left at the start of the takeoff phase. This is if you're taking off from the left foot, of course. For the right foot, it will be a lean towards the right. Now, the curve has 2 purposes, and we talked about this in one of the previous lectures. One of the purposes is to make the athlete have a lean towards the left at the plant, at the start of the takeoff phase, so that you can be vertical or almost vertical at the end of the takeoff phase. The other purpose is to lower the center of mass without having to flex the legs very much. If you are vertical, your center of mass will be at a certain height. Think, for example, about your waist, the center of your body, and you're vertical and it's at a certain height. If you lean your whole body, that center of your body will be in a lower position. So we saw in lecture number 1, I think it was number 1, that you wanted to run fast, but you also wanted to run with your body in a low position at the end of the run-up. So the amount of how fast you should go, how low you should be, that combination depends on how strong the athlete is. The stronger high jumper should go faster and lower, or maybe very, very much faster and a little bit lower, or a little bit faster and very, very much lower. But the combination of how fast and how low has to be faster and or lower than for a weaker high jumper. So a problem with this is that it's difficult to run fast and to run with bent legs at the same time. So this factor that we see here, that by running on a curve, you can lower the center of mass, but you don't have to flex the legs. It's just simply leaning already gets you lower. So it's good to have this curve for this reason, but some coaches take this to an extreme. They will say, oh, great, so you're running on a curve, that gets you low already. You don't have to think about getting your center of mass low in the run-up. You don't have to run with bent legs at all because you're running on a curve. You're already low because of that. Now, that is true if you have a very weak high jumper. So if you have a high jumper jumping maybe 150, 170, something like that, maybe that's true, that just simply by running on a curve with a small radius, you can get your center of mass to an optimum lowering of the center of mass. However, if you're a higher level athlete, maybe you're jumping 2 meters, 220, 240, then no, it's impossible to get low enough simply by running on a curve. So you do have to run a little bit with bent legs, no matter what. Okay, so let me make a quick summary of angular momentum. You need to produce twisting angular momentum. Everybody does that okay, no problem. You need to get somersaulting angular momentum. And relative to the final direction of the run-up, you can break it down into 2 components. One is going to be the forward somersault rotation, and then we'll have also a lateral somersaulting rotation, which requires lateral somersaulting angular momentum. And the sum of the two is the total somersaulting angular momentum, which is what we can see best in the view along the bar.
È quello che vediamo con una vista lungo l'asticella, come avessimo l'asticella davanti a noi.
Okay, so our high jumper has done the run-up, took off from the ground. And now, after the takeoff is completed, 2 very important things are fixed that cannot be changed. One is the path of the center of mass. That is fixed. It's going to reach a peak height of 2.17 meters. And you say, oh, I like it to be 2.19. Impossible, 2.17. Or you say, nah, I don't like the jump. I want to just go down. I want it to go only to 2 meters and get out. No, you cannot. You're there for the ride. You're going to have to go and follow that path. You cannot change it. Also, angular momentum is fixed. So there's no way that you can leave the ground and say, oh, I like a little bit more angular momentum. No. So a lot of what's going to happen in the air is fixed by the time you leave the ground. A lot is decided, but not everything. Once you're in the air, you have a certain degree of freedom. Okay, so in the air, if you translate one part of the body in one direction, some other part or some other parts of the body will translate in the opposite direction to keep the center of mass in the same original path. So if I take off from the ground and I lift my arms way over my head, the rest of my body will go down a little bit to compensate to keep the center of mass in the same place. So here we're talking about translation, right? Translate up or down, left or right. It's translation, is not rotation. But also, if you rotate one part of the body in one direction, some other part or parts will rotate in the opposite direction to keep the whole body with the same original amount of angular momentum. So you could call this translational and rotational action and reaction. So it's action and reaction. And a good example of this is arching. So let's look at arching a little bit. Here we have a high jumper with the shoulders reaching the bar. Now, if this athlete translates the head downward and translates the legs downward, well, something is going to have to go up to compensate, and that will be the hips.
Prendiamo questo atleta che sta per arrivare sull'asticella. Se l'atleta abbassa contemporaneamente sia la testa sia le gambe, qualcos'altro dovrà andare in alto, e quello che andrà in alto saranno le anche.
So if the hips go up, this is good, because then that means that you have a little bit of extra room here between your hips and the bar. Okay, so this is very good. This is a good trick. And you might think, well, okay, so you take off, then you arch, and you just stay in this position, frozen in that position, and you're rotating, you're somersaulting over the bar, and the legs will eventually clear the bar. You think. Yes, but that's not true. Nobody has so much angular momentum. So somehow you will need to make those legs go up quickly at some point. And for that, you need to do what is called the unarching. So what does that mean? That means that at some point, you will make your head go up, and that'll make, and your legs will also go up, and your hips will go down. So this is looking at it in a translational sense, but you can also look at it from the point of view of rotation. What you have done here, let me go back and forth. Okay, what you've done is that there's a clockwise rotation of the trunk, and that produces an increase in the counterclockwise rotation of the legs. Of course, that means that the head has gone up, the legs have gone up, something has to go down, so your hips went down. And because of this, good timing is very necessary for the unarching. So if you unarch too soon, then you will just sit on the bar, and your hips will knock the bar down. If you unarch too late, if you start the unarching too late, then your calves will catch the bar and will knock it down, your calves or your heels. This part of the leg will catch the bar. When should you start the unarching? Well, I used a rough, what we call a rule of thumb, a general rule. So we have here the hip, the mid-hip. We have here the left knee, the right knee, and this is the mid-knee, the midpoint between the knees. And we can make a line going between the two. So this point here is about 1/3 of the length of the thigh. When this point passes, when this point is directly over the bar, that is when you should start the unarching. Okay, so this arching, it brings us to another question, which is the definition of arching. So we have to distinguish between the arching of the trunk or of the spine and the arching of the whole body. And of those two, the whole body arching is by far the most important of the two. So we're going to look at those two kinds of arching in the next slide. Okay, trunk arching versus whole body arching. Here we have our athlete, and the first thing we'll see is those 2 points. This is called the suprasternale, and this is called the mid-hip, and that is the 2 endpoints of the trunk. Is the curvature of the trunk. Okay, so then now I'm going to draw the 2 knees. So this is the right knee, the left knee, and the mid knee. And I'm going to draw a line going from the hip through the mid knee. And then I'm going to make a line from the suprasternal to the mid hip, and I'm going to extend it beyond the mid hip. So those 2 lines are not aligned. They're different from each other. And there's this angle, theta, that tells us that that person has a very big whole body arching. Okay, let's see another example. The trunk looks exactly the same, but the legs are different. So we go again, suprasternal, mid-hip, and trunk midline. Then we have the 2 knees and the midpoint of the knees and the line going through the knees. The long axis of the trunk almost coincide with each other. So I would say there's 0 arching in this case, even though you have the same bending of the trunk. Okay, so this is a third situation, same thing. I'll go quickly. You'll have the same trunk exactly. And then you go with a line through the mid-knee. So I would say in this case, we have negative arching. So if you just look at the trunk, you would say, good arching, and good arching. But if you look at the whole body, it's good arching, no arching, and negative arching. Okay, so this is action and reaction we've been talking about, and that included the arching. But now there's another degree of freedom that you have in the air. Okay, it is possible to make the whole body rotate faster with the same angular momentum. You can make the whole body rotate faster by making the body be more compact about the axis of rotation. And we're going to be looking at the somersault rotation over the bar. And you can make the body be more compact through changes in the configuration of the arms or changes in the configuration of the legs. Okay, so using the arms, let's see, this athlete has the arms extended beyond the head. So there's a big distance from here, from the arm to the center of mass. So this is not compact. This is very extended, which produces a slow somersault rotation. Now, if you put your arms in this other position, now the arms, let's see the center of the arms, maybe here. You can see that distance is very small. So the body is much more compact. And this produces a faster somersault rotation. So, I mean, there's no miracles here. Maybe you'll rotate 10% faster, maybe, but maybe that's just what you need. So what we're doing here is very similar to the figure skater that we saw in the previous talk. In the case of the figure skater, we were talking about rotation about a vertical axis. So the athlete was rotating about this vertical axis with the arms very spread out. Then the arms came to the middle, closer to the axis of rotation, and the rotation became much faster. The example we see here on the slide is really the same thing, but it's about an axis that is parallel to the bar. And it's a somersault rotation, it's not a twist rotation. So using the arms, you can achieve this, but you can also do it using the legs. So here we have this body configuration, and you can see that the knees are not very flexed. This is not a bad position. This is pretty good. And it produces a moderately fast somersault rotation. It's not bad, but then if you're like this, with the knees more flexed, the body is much more compact because the legs, instead of being at this distance from the center of mass, they're at a smaller distance from the center of mass. So you will somersault faster. Now, if you want an athlete to do this motion on the right part of the slide, you should not tell the athlete, bend your knees. Because very likely what the athlete will do is get into a fetal position, which is not what you want. Okay, let me make the drawing here. Fetal, like a fetus.
Ah, okay, yep.
We don't want this. We want this position here. And for that, what you can tell the athlete is when you are at the peak of the jump, try to kick the bar with your heels. Okay, so it's not a fetal position. It's like trying to kick the bar from below with your heels. And this produces a faster somersault rotation. Of course, if you get into this position here on the right, it's tricky because the unarching has to be very precise. I did not invent this position. I first saw it in Schobert was using it. Yes, I noticed that Schobert has a very, very effective bar clearance. Well, how do you define an effective bar clearance? Well, let's say that your peak height of your center of mass reaches 2 meters. Okay, so let's say that your center of mass reaches a peak height of 2 meters. If you can clear a bar that is 3 or 4 centimeters lower than that, so if you can clear a bar of 196, 197, we say, yeah, not bad. It's pretty good. If, on the other hand, if you can only clear a bar that is maybe 10 centimeters below, so peak height of center of mass 2 meters, maximum bar height that you can clear is 190, you have a very bad bar clearance. Well, I saw that Schobert could clear a bar that was higher than the peak height of the center of mass. He could clear a bar, if the center of mass was at 2 meters, he could clear 201 or 202. So that was amazing. It's fantastically good. And he was not doing it at 2 meters. He was doing it at 235 or something like that, of course. So I said, well, how does he do that? And I said, he must have a lot of angular momentum, so he can arch a lot and just rotate like crazy. And I look at his angular momentum is like, pretty normal. What he had is he had this position at the peak of the jump. Okay, so I talked about a bad bar clearance. So if you can clear, the best bar that you can clear is 10 centimeters below your peak of your center of mass, that is a terrible bar clearance. If the best you can jump is a bar that is located maybe 6, 5, 4 centimeters below the peak height of the center of mass, we say, it's okay, nothing great, but yeah, it's all right, no big problem, but not great. If you can clear a bar set 3, 2, 1 centimeters below the peak height of the center of mass, wow, we do not tell you to change anything. You are doing great. And if you can clear a bar higher than the peak height of the center of mass, which so far only Schobert, I've never seen anybody else do it, then you're God. Okay, so if your bar clearance is bad, what can produce that? One reason is insufficient angular momentum. And why would that be? Well, maybe you did not have enough backward lean at the start of the takeoff phase, or you did not have enough lean towards the left at the beginning of the takeoff phase. There could be other reasons for insufficient angular momentum. We'll talk about them a little bit later. Another possible problem is insufficient arching. Or you have good arching, but your timing is terrible. Okay, so now there's one last thing. We're almost at the end. There can be problems for the rotation over the bar when the high jumper uses very strong double arm and lead leg actions during the takeoff phase. We're going to see why that is. Okay, in any jump, to produce angular momentum in a particular direction, it's necessary to rotate parts of the body in that same direction during the takeoff phase. The body parts that are used to generate the angular momentum could be the arms, or the lead leg, or the trunk and head. In high jumping, the trunk and head is what is most generally used to produce the angular momentum, but the arms and the lead leg can also have an effect. And this can produce a problem in the generation of forward somersaulting angular momentum. Okay, so now I have to get out of my PowerPoint. Okay, so let's say I am standing like this, and I want to jump up, and I want to rotate counterclockwise in the air. I need counterclockwise angular momentum about my vertical axis. I'm going to do it with my arms. So what I will do is I will start with my arms here, and I'll throw my arms that way during the takeoff. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the arms rotate counterclockwise about the vertical axis, and when I leave the ground, I have counterclockwise angular momentum about the vertical axis. If I wanted to rotate clockwise about the vertical axis, then my arms, I would throw them this way.
Clockwise, I think.
Okay, so you may think, wait a minute, but you told us before, when one part of the body rotates in one direction, the rest of the body tries to rotate in the opposite direction. That is when you're in the air. So in the air, if I did this with my arms, the rest of my body will go the other way. So keep this in mind. Arms rotate counterclockwise. Remember, counterclockwise about the vertical axis. As I do this, my trunk and my legs tend to go the other way. My feet are on the ground, so my feet tend to go this way, tend to rotate clockwise. So my right foot pulls backward, and my left foot pushes forward on the ground. By reaction, the ground pushes forward on my right foot and pushes backward on my left foot. So this is counterclockwise torque made on my feet. So my body is just received from the ground a counterclockwise torque that is in the same direction. Remember, I told you to remember this, same direction as the arms were thrown. Okay, so in the air, the arms go this way, the rest of the body just goes the other way. Whereas on the ground, the arms go this way, the rest of the body tries to go the other way, but the ground is there, so you make a clockwise torque on the ground makes a counterclockwise torque on you, and the body in total gets a counterclockwise angular momentum, which is angular momentum in the same direction as the direction in which I threw the arms. Okay, so we go back to the high jump now. And we're looking now at the generation of forward somersaulting angular momentum. So here's our jumper seen from the side, and I need to produce angular momentum of this kind, right? Counterclockwise. And this is linked to the motion of my trunk and of my head, which will be like this. I'm going to go from the backward leaning to vertical, so it's this. So that gives me counterclockwise angular momentum, helps me through my feet actions on the ground, helps to produce this counterclockwise forward somersaulting angular momentum. But at the same time as my trunk is going like this, look at my arms. Look at my lead leg. So the actions of the arms and of the lead leg are going against the generation of this forward somersaulting angular momentum that you want to produce. So this is subtraction of angular momentum. So this is a particularly big problem. It's always there, but it's a particularly big problem when you have a very wide motion of the arms or a very wide motion of the lead leg. This problem is really marked in athlete with very strong arm and lead leg actions during the takeoff. For example, Sotomayor. Because of this, Sotomayor over the bar was never very good. Those actions of the legs and of the arms, they were good for generating a lot of height in the jump, but they interfered with the generation of angular momentum. So he was always pretty desperate at the top of the jump. Okay, so you want the strong arm and lead leg actions because they help you to get more height, but on the other hand, they mess up your rotation. Is there a way to alleviate this problem? Yes. Well, here's the idea. Instead of throwing the arm straight forward like this, you could use what is called a diagonal arm action. And I will give you a very extreme version of this, and then I will say, of course, you cannot do this, but you can go halfway towards that, and it will be good. So what these athletes will do, the ones who use this diagonal arm action, is in the last step of the run-up, they twist the trunk to the left. So instead of going like this, they go like this. So let's see a very extreme example that is not realistic, but let's look at it. So imagine if I'm like this, but I twist my trunk 90 degrees to the left.
Okay.
So my hips are facing that way, but my shoulders are facing that way. So if I swing my arms this way, those arms do not interfere with a forward somersault. So this produces a lot of interference. This produces no interference. But realistically, I'll go 45 degrees that way. So it interferes with a forward somersault, but not so much. So using a diagonal arm action, the arm action will interfere less with the forward somersault, with the generation of forward somersaulting angular momentum. Okay, so now let's look at a view from the back of the high jumper. We're going to look at the lateral somersaulting angular momentum. So I'm going to face away from you. So I'm like this. I'll have a lean to the left, and I'll go like this to the vertical, right? If my arms move straight forward, do they affect this angular momentum? No. But if I use a diagonal arm action, you have a clockwise, which helps with the generation of lateral somersaulting angular momentum. Okay, here we see a jumper that uses what I call the direct forward arm action. And he has very strong arm and lead leg actions. So you see the foot, you see how the foot is very low, it's almost touching the ground, and the leg is going to go like this and then up. The arms are going to do a very wide clockwise motion. This athlete is going to have a lot of problems generating forward somersaulting angular momentum. Now this other athlete, he's doing the diagonal arm action. So you can see that the right shoulder is farther forward and the left shoulder is farther back. So he's not facing exactly towards us, but he's roughly at a 45-degree angle. And the arm action is less wide. Oops.
E l'azione delle braccia è meno grande, meno accentuata rispetto a quello precedente.
Well, it's about as strong as the previous athlete, but it's in a different direction. It's in this diagonal direction. So in this view, we don't see so much clockwise motion.
In realtà l'azione è tanto grande, tanto forte quanto quella del precedente, soltanto che essendo in un piano che non è perpendicolare a quello che stiamo vedendo noi, ci sembra che sia minore.
Okay, now let's see the view from the back.
Vediamo da dietro.
Okay, so this is the first jumper, and the arms go almost straight forward. They're a little bit diagonal, but not very much.
Vedete che vanno abbastanza in avanti, leggermente diagonale, ma non così
They're a
tanto.
little bit diagonal, so they are helping a little bit with the clockwise lateral somersaulting angular momentum.
Quindi quel minimo di diagonalità che sta dando probabilmente gli starà aiutando nella generazione del momento angolare. Yep.
But not very much. Now we see the other guy. Look where he is. Look at those arms.
Guardate invece
Elbows.
questo atleta come è molto invece diagonale rispetto alla vista che abbiamo adesso per il momento angolare laterale.
Okay, so the arms are producing clockwise angular momentum, so they are helping actively in the generation of lateral somersaulting angular momentum. So this athlete ends up he's lost part of the forward somersaulting angular momentum, but we're reducing how much he loses, and then he's able to get more lateral somersaulting angular momentum by using the diagonal arm action.
In questo modo, con questa azione delle braccia in diagonale, va a aumentare il momento angolare laterale in senso orario e andrà a ridurre meno l'effetto riduttivo, diciamo, l'effetto negativo che potrebbe avere in quello frontale.
Okay, we're almost at the end. So what do you need for a good technique? This is the summary of summaries. You want a fast run-up. You want low hips at the end of the run-up, but not too fast, not too low. There's a limit. It depends on how strong you are. You want strong arm and lead leg actions during the takeoff phase, keeping in mind that if they're very strong, you may have problems in generating angular momentum. You have to decide if what you lose in angular momentum is compensated by the greater height of the jump. You need to generate a sufficient amount of angular momentum, which means that you have to have a good backward lean when you plant the foot on the ground. You need to have a good lateral lean towards the left when you plant the foot on the ground. And you want your body vertical at the end of the takeoff. Keeping in mind that for the forward somersault rotation, yes, you want it vertical. For the lateral somersaulting angular momentum, you probably should go a little bit beyond the vertical, between 0 and 10 degrees beyond the vertical. That's the ideal. And finally, you need to arch and unarch with good timing over the bar. And finally, that's it. We're finished.